Hi everyone. Thank you for being here. Let's start with a question. When life gets hard, who do you call first? Most of us would say, a best friend, a parent, maybe a mentor. And that makes sense, we're human, we crave connection. But I want to explore something deeper. What if we practiced calling on God first? Now, before we dive in, let's be honest, faith is not always easy. It's messy. It's full of doubt. And sometimes, it feels like silence. But what I've learned both through research and through my own very human, very imperfect journey is this. Calling on God isn't about having the answers. It's about having the courage to ask the questions. In my work, I talk a lot about vulnerability. People often mistake it for weakness. But vulnerability, in its rawest form, is the willingness to say, I don't know what to do. I can't do this alone. I need help. That is not weakness. That's where faith begins. Keynote 1: Vulnerability is not weakness, it's where faith begins. When we call on God first, we're not giving up. We're showing up in our truth, in our struggle, in our fear, and saying, I trust that I don't have to carry this alone. Keynote 2: We're wired for connection, and that includes a spiritual connection. Neuroscience backs this up. Our brains are literally built to seek attachment. Yes, we need connection with people, but there's something even more profound: our longing for spiritual belonging. Calling on God first isn't just a religious act, it's a deeply human one. It reminds us we're not just here to perform or prove, we're here to belong. Keynote 3: Faith isn't a backup plan, it's the foundation. Let me ask you, how many times have you tried everything else first, and only then whispered a quiet prayer? What if we flipped that? What if faith wasn't plan B? Calling on God first isn't about abandoning action. It's about aligning our actions with trust. It's saying, I'll still work, I'll still show up, but I won't pretend I have to control it all. Keynote 4: Courage means choosing connection over control. Control is seductive. It makes us feel safe. But it also isolates us. Calling on God is a radical act of surrender. Not giving up but giving over. Saying, God, I don't know what's next. But I'm starting with you. So here's the takeaway. Calling on God first is not about being more spiritual or more holy. It's about being braver. It's about leading from the inside out. It's about trusting that we are held, especially when life feels like it's falling apart. Because in the end, God doesn't ask for perfection. Just presence. Not polish, but honesty. Let's be the people who don't wait until everything is broken to seek something greater. Let's start with connection. Let's start with trust. Let's start with God. Let's call on God first. We live in a world that often tells us to be strong, to keep it together, to be composed and unshakable. From a young age, we are taught to associate strength with independence, with stoicism, with never showing weakness. And somewhere along the way, we start to believe that needing help, asking questions, admitting pain, or doubt, those are signs of failure. Of not being enough. Of weakness. But here's what I've come to understand, both from research and from my own deeply personal experiences: what we call weakness is often the most profound expression of courage. Vulnerability, the open-hearted willingness to be seen, to risk uncertainty, to say I don't know or I need help, is not weakness. It is the birthplace of faith. Faith doesn't begin in certainty. It begins in surrender. It begins when we are brave enough to admit we are not in control. I want you to picture a moment in your life when everything felt uncertain. Maybe it was a diagnosis. Maybe it was a loss. Maybe it was the slow burn of burnout, or the quiet weight of anxiety that you carried while pretending to be fine. In those moments, when the mask starts to slip and the cracks begin to show, there's a choice we make, often unconsciously. We either double down on control, or we choose connection. Calling on God in those moments requires a sacred kind of vulnerability. It's saying, I can't fix this alone. I don't even know what the next step is. But I'm reaching out. I'm trusting something bigger than myself. That's not weak. That is wildly, deeply courageous. Our culture is uncomfortable with this idea because it runs counter to how we've been taught to survive. We hustle. We strive. We perform. We perfect. And then, when none of that works, when the cracks widen and our hearts ache, we whisper a quiet prayer not as a first instinct, but as a last resort. But what if we reversed that? What if faith wasn't the fallback plan, but the starting place? What if we could reframe vulnerability not as a desperate admission of defeat, but as a conscious and sacred act of trust? Calling on God first doesn't mean we don't take action. It doesn't mean we avoid responsibility or wait passively for answers to fall from the sky. It means we anchor our actions in surrender. We lead with humility. We begin with connection. That's where real transformation happens. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, a woman I interviewed told me about a time when she had lost everything: her job, her marriage, her confidence. She was, in her words, a professional fixer, someone who could always find a way to bounce back. But this time was different. She tried everything: therapists, self-help books, new jobs. Nothing worked. Finally, she said, she sat in her car one night, parked outside a grocery store, and broke down. No plan. No control. Just tears and exhaustion. And in that quiet, she said out loud, "God, I don't know what to do. I need you." That was the moment her life began to change, not because everything got instantly better, but because she finally stopped pretending she had to carry it all alone. That moment of spiritual surrender was her first real act of healing. And that story? It's not rare. It's all of us. We are so often walking around with heavy armor: emotional, spiritual, relational, thinking it's what's keeping us safe. But that armor? It also keeps us isolated. It cuts us off from the connection that heals us. It cuts us off from faith. When we dare to drop that armor and say, "God, I'm tired. I'm scared. I need you," something inside of us softens. And that softening is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's alignment. It's the very beginning of something sacred. Vulnerability is also what makes faith real, rather than performative. It's easy to say we trust God when everything's going right, when our lives are smooth and predictable. But real trust is built in the valley, not the mountaintop. It's forged in the moments when we don't know what's next. That's when calling on God isn't a platitude, it's a lifeline. And here's the powerful truth: God doesn't require us to show up perfectly. He doesn't need our polished prayers or our spiritual resumes. He wants us raw, honest, human. That's where the relationship begins. That's where faith becomes real, not a checklist, but a living, breathing connection that holds us through the mess. I think sometimes we imagine God is waiting for us to get it all together before we come to Him. But it's the opposite. God is most present when we are most broken. He meets us not in spite of our vulnerability, but through it. And when we dare to show up like that, unfiltered, unguarded, we open the door to a deeper kind of strength. A strength that doesn't come from pretending we have it all figured out, but from trusting that we don't have to. So when I say vulnerability is where faith begins, I don't mean it metaphorically. I mean it literally. Every time you choose to say, "God, I can't do this without you," you're exercising the muscle of faith. You're practicing the brave, beautiful art of letting go. You're saying, "I believe there's something beyond me that is for me, that sees me, that loves me even in this." That is not weakness. That is the purest form of courage. And it is how everything truly begins. One of the most fundamental truths about being human is this: we are wired for connection. From the moment we are born, we reach for it, grasping for someone to hold us, to feed us, to keep us safe. It's not a learned behavior, it's embedded in our biology. We are neurologically, emotionally, and psychologically built for connection. That's not just a poetic idea, it's neuroscience. Our brains light up in the presence of relational safety. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, is released during physical touch, eye contact, even shared laughter. It's as if our bodies already know what our souls are still trying to believe: we are not meant to do life alone. But there's another layer of this truth that often goes unspoken, especially in the context of busy, performance-driven, modern life. Yes, we are wired for human connection, but we are also deeply wired for spiritual connection. There is something within us, call it soul, spirit, consciousness, or longing, that seeks something beyond the physical. Something sacred. Something eternal. And that longing is not weakness or superstition. It is a fundamental part of who we are. When we ignore this spiritual dimension, something starts to unravel inside us. We can have full schedules and empty hearts. We can be surrounded by people and still feel deeply alone. We can have all the external signs of success, and still lie awake at night wondering, is this it? Is this all there is? And more often than not, we keep trying to fill that internal ache with more doing, more scrolling, more noise. But the ache doesn't come from a lack of activity. It comes from a lack of alignment. A lack of connection to the deeper, quieter parts of ourselves and to the one who created us. I think about the way we're taught to succeed, be strong, be smart, be capable. All good things. But in all that striving, we often lose touch with the sacred rhythms of the heart. We stop making space for stillness. We stop listening for God. We forget that connection isn't just about talking to people, it's about listening to the voice that lives beneath the surface. The voice that says, "You're not alone. You never were." Spiritual connection isn't a substitute for community, it's the root of it. When we call on God first, when we acknowledge our dependence on something greater than ourselves, we're not isolating, we're grounding. We're becoming more capable of healthy relationships because we're not demanding that other people fill the God-shaped hole inside of us. We're not asking others to fix, rescue, or validate us. Instead, we're bringing our full selves anchored, humbled, connected into those relationships. I've had conversations with people from all walks of life, leaders, parents, students, doctors, creatives, and what I've found over and over again is this: no matter how impressive someone seems on the outside, we're all walking around with the same basic need to know that our life has meaning. To feel seen. To be loved, not for what we do, but for who we are. And that kind of knowing, deep, unshakable worthiness doesn't come from awards or praise. It comes from a spiritual connection to the source of our identity. God is not distant. God is not waiting for us to get it together before we reach out. God is not impressed by our curated lives. He is moved by our honesty. By our willingness to say, "I'm hurting. I'm tired. I need you." That's where the connection begins, not in performance, but in presence. You see, when we don't cultivate spiritual connection, we can start to live like we're alone in the universe. Everything becomes about hustle and pressure. Every failure feels personal. Every success feels like a fleeting hit of validation. But when we do nurture that connection, when we call on God not just in crisis, but in the quiet, everyday moments, something shifts. We begin to operate from a place of trust instead of fear. We stop trying to control everything and start learning how to surrender. And in that surrender, we find peace, not because the circumstances change, but because we change. There's a phrase I often return to when life feels chaotic: be still and know that I am God. Not be perfect, not be productive. Just be still. That stillness is where connection happens. Not through performance, but through presence. And it doesn't have to be in a church, or on a mountaintop. It can happen in your car on the way to work. It can happen in the laundry room. It can happen in the moment you pause to breathe and say, "God, I'm here. Are you?" And the answer is always yes. We need this kind of connection. Not because it makes us feel good, but because it grounds us in truth. It reminds us who we are and whose we are. In a world full of distractions, competition, comparison, and noise, spiritual connection is the one thing that keeps us centered. It's not an accessory to life, it's the foundation. I think one of the most damaging messages we've internalized is that faith is something reserved for the very spiritual. But here's the reality: we all have a spirit. Whether you're a CEO or a college student, whether you've been to church every Sunday or you haven't prayed in years, your spirit is longing for connection. It's not about religion, it's about relationship. It's about remembering that you are deeply, eternally loved, and that you don't have to earn that love. So when we say we're wired for connection, let's not stop at the surface. Let's go deeper. Let's remember that we're not just minds or bodies, we are spiritual beings. And we flourish when we are connected to our source. That's not just philosophy. It's our design. Call on God first, not as a ritual, but as a relationship. Not because you have all the answers, but because you're finally willing to ask the real questions. That kind of connection changes everything. It grounds us in love, frees us from fear, and reminds us again and again that we are never alone. There's a pattern I've noticed, not just in others, but in myself too. When life is smooth, when things are going according to plan, we move through our days on autopilot, handling things, solving problems, making decisions, checking the boxes. We might say we believe in God, that we trust Him, that we're walking by faith. But often, what we're really doing is leaning on our own strength, our own intelligence, our own plans. And then, when everything falls apart, when the job disappears, the relationship ends, the diagnosis comes, or the path ahead vanishes in fog, that's when we remember faith. That's when we panic and reach for God like the emergency glass on the wall, break in case of crisis. And I get it. It's human. When things are going well, we don't feel the need to call on something deeper. But what if we've misunderstood the role of faith in our lives? What if faith was never meant to be the backup plan? What if it was meant to be the blueprint we start with? We don't build homes by guessing our way through construction and then calling an engineer after the walls fall down. We start with a foundation. We build on something solid. Something tested. Something trustworthy. And yet, we often try to build our lives, our identities, our relationships, our futures on sand, on ambition, on approval, on success, on our own understanding. Then when the winds come, we're shocked when everything starts to crack. Faith, real faith, isn't about checking in with God only when we're desperate. It's about inviting Him into the blueprint of our lives from the very beginning. It's about starting with trust, not arriving at it after everything else has failed. It's about saying, God, I don't want to just consult you when I'm stuck, I want you to be the one guiding the way from the start. There's a subtle danger in treating God like a last resort. It reinforces the belief that we are the center of everything, that our plans, our control, our vision is what will carry us. And when it doesn't, we collapse. Not just because we are hurting, but because we feel unanchored, untethered, adrift. And here's the painful truth: anything we build on a foundation of control will eventually be shaken. Faith is not just a nice idea for hard times. It's not an emotional crutch or a safety net for the weak. It is a framework. A way of seeing, moving, choosing, and living. It doesn't mean we won't face uncertainty, it means we won't face it alone. It doesn't mean we won't struggle, it means we'll struggle with a deeper kind of strength. Not the strength that comes from gritting our teeth, but the strength that comes from knowing we're not carrying it by ourselves. I once heard someone say, you can only fall as far as your foundation. That landed hard. Because if your foundation is fear, when life shakes you, you'll fall into fear. If your foundation is achievement, you'll fall into burnout and shame. If your foundation is other people's approval, you'll fall into loneliness and insecurity. But if your foundation is faith, not the kind you perform for others, but the kind you practice, then when life shakes you, and it will, you will fall into grace. You will fall into peace. You will fall into the arms of a God who saw the storm coming before you did, and who already knew how to hold you through it. The thing about faith is that it asks for something most of us resist: surrender. Not in a passive, helpless way, but in a courageous, intentional way. Surrender means we choose trust before we see the outcome. We choose to follow even when we don't know where the path is leading. That's not weakness. That's radical strength. That's building our lives on something more eternal than circumstances. I've had moments when I've looked at my life and thought, I'm not in control of any of this. And depending on where I'm standing, how connected I am to my foundation, those moments either fill me with panic or with peace. The difference isn't what's happening around me. The difference is what I'm standing on. Faith changes the way I interpret uncertainty. It shifts my internal posture from fear to openness. From what if everything goes wrong, to even if it does, I am not alone. And I want to be clear, this isn't about pretending. Faith isn't denial. It doesn't mean we avoid pain or bypass reality. Faith doesn't mean we don't make plans or work hard. It means we don't anchor our identity in those plans. It means that underneath everything we're building, there is something stronger holding us up. It's hard to live this way, especially in a world that tells us to hustle harder, achieve more, and never show weakness. But faith reminds us that life isn't just about climbing ladders, it's about staying rooted. It's not about appearances, it's about alignment. It's not about control, it's about connection. When we build our lives on faith, we are not guaranteed ease. But we are promised presence. We are promised that when the storms hit, we'll have a foundation that holds. We'll be able to bend without breaking. We'll know where to turn not as an afterthought, but as a first instinct. So maybe it's time to stop treating faith like the fire extinguisher behind the glass. Maybe it's time to stop waiting until the bottom falls out to remember that we were never meant to carry all of this alone. Maybe it's time to stop building on temporary things and start anchoring ourselves in something unshakable. Faith was never meant to be your backup plan. It was always meant to be your beginning. Courage is often seen as something that requires immense strength. We tend to think of it as the ability to face fear head-on and to press forward despite uncertainty. But what if the truest form of courage isn't about pushing through on our own, but about choosing connection over control? What if the bravest thing we can do isn't to tighten our grip on the things we can't control, but to loosen our hold and choose to trust, choose to connect in the face of that uncertainty? We live in a world that tells us we need to be in control. From the moment we wake up, we are taught to manage our time, our energy, our careers, and our relationships. We are trained to control our outcomes, to plan our futures, and to have a strategy for every part of our lives. Control becomes our shield, our source of strength. But as anyone who has ever tried to control something, anything knows, it doesn't always work. The more we grip tightly to the things we can't change, the more we feel the weight of the world on our shoulders. And when the unexpected happens, and it always does, we are left feeling unmoored, exhausted, and disconnected. What if, instead of trying to control everything around us, we chose connection instead? What if, in those moments when things feel impossible to manage, the most courageous thing we could do was to open ourselves up to others and to God instead of holding everything in? What if we stopped seeing vulnerability as weakness and started recognizing it as the pathway to real strength? Real courage? True courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act in spite of it. And often, the most terrifying thing to do is to admit that we need others, that we don't have it all figured out, and that we can't control the outcome. But in choosing connection over control, we allow ourselves to be seen. We let others in, and we let God in. We surrender to the truth that life isn't something to be micromanaged, but something to be lived in relationship with others, with ourselves, and with God. The first time I truly understood what it meant to choose connection over control was when I faced a personal crisis. I was in a season of life where I was trying to manage everything: my work, my family, my friendships, my health. I was juggling, balancing, and maintaining, thinking I could hold it all together. But deep down, I felt exhausted. I felt like I was running on empty. My relationships were suffering because I was trying to control every interaction, and my work was consuming me, leaving no space for connection. I became so consumed with managing outcomes that I forgot the importance of simply being present. It wasn't until I hit a breaking point that I realized the cost of trying to control everything. I couldn't keep going like this. I had reached a point where my mind and body were screaming for rest, but my pride wouldn't let me slow down. In that moment, I had to make a choice. I could either keep trying to do everything on my own and burn myself out, or I could choose to let go and connect with the people who cared about me. I could surrender my need for control and lean into the support that was always available, but I had to be willing to let others see my vulnerability, to let go of the facade that I had everything under control. And that was the hardest, most courageous thing I've ever done. I made the decision to reach out, to call on friends, to ask for help, to admit that I was struggling. And what happened next was profound. The very thing I feared, the vulnerability, turned out to be the bridge that connected me to the love, support, and strength I needed. By choosing connection over control, I realized I wasn't just leaning on others, I was also leaning on God. I was choosing to trust that there was something bigger than my own strength, something more constant than my need for perfection. This is what courage truly looks like, not holding everything together, but allowing ourselves to fall apart, trusting that others and God will be there to help us pick up the pieces. It's the courage to say, I can't do this alone, and to trust that, in the process of asking for help, we will find the strength we need. Courage is not about being self-sufficient. It's about being willing to depend on others when we need it most. The more I leaned into connection over control, the more I understood that this wasn't just a temporary fix. It wasn't about putting a band-aid on a broken situation. It was a shift in mindset, a fundamental reorientation of how I viewed strength and vulnerability. Connection became my foundation. It became the lens through which I saw the world. And I realized that true strength comes from the courage to embrace the unknown, to lean on others, and to trust that the world is not a place to conquer but a place to navigate with others by our side. In choosing connection over control, we allow ourselves to live in the present moment. We stop obsessing over what might happen in the future or what has already happened in the past, and we focus on being fully present with those around us. We stop living in fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of rejection, and we begin to live in the freedom of faith, of trust, of the knowledge that we are not alone. We are supported by the people who love us, and we are carried by the grace of God. That is the true courage, letting go of the need to control every outcome and choosing instead to surrender, to trust, and to be open to the connections that God has placed in our lives. When we choose connection over control, we are not giving up our power. We are stepping into a more profound kind of strength, the kind that comes from vulnerability, humility, and trust. We stop seeing ourselves as isolated individuals fighting for control, and we start seeing ourselves as part of a bigger story, one that we don't have to navigate alone. That's where real courage lies, in the ability to lean into the unknown, to connect with others in our brokenness, and to trust that, even in our most vulnerable moments, we are held, we are loved, and we are never alone. Thank you so much for watching. I'm grateful to have friends like you supporting this channel. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more, and I appreciate all of your love and support. See you next time.